Welcome to the Loins of History, a podcast connecting the past to the present and correcting historical and political illiteracy. I'm Colin, and I'm joined by my co-host, Jay. Jay's going to be continuing the series on the Han Dynasty, the fall of the Han Dynasty, and today we're going to talk about the Yellow Turban Rebellion. So, Jay, I'll hand it off to you for a quick summary and some key takeaways.
Thanks, Colin. Yeah, like you said, today's episode is going to be on the Yellow Turban Rebellion, which was a major peasant uprising that was religious in nature in the year 184, and it kind of bled into 185 a little bit. And we're going to look and see the role that the Yellow Turban Rebellion played in the downfall of the first major Chinese dynasty, right after the Qin dynasty. So the second major dynasty, but the first big one, that was kind of like a cultural golden age for China. And Colin and I were kind of talking before we started recording here about how this rebellion kind of parallels some rebellions within the Qing dynasty. And if you really like Chinese history, we finished up a 20+ episode on U.S. and Chinese relations, and we talked at length about Qing dynasty in the 18 and 1900s. Qing dynasty, I think, was founded in the 16 or 1700s. I think 1700s. This rebellion kind of models or is similar to a lot of those rebellions in that the Yellow Turban Rebellion did not kill the Han Dynasty. The Han Dynasty survived. The Han Dynasty, the last emperor, was deposed in the year 220 AD, whereas this rebellion, like I said, it was in 184 and 185. So there was still, 25 years of continued Han rule, but kind of similar to the Qing dynasty, this rebellion really was kind of a high watermark with some issues within the government, and it should have been a wake-up call to the Han, to the administration there in Luoyang, but it was not heeded. The Han was able to put down the rebellion. The imperial armies were successful, but the issues continued. So we're going to look and see what issues led to this rebellion. How did the rebellion take place? What did the Han do to put it down? And then why that's significant for today. All right. So just kind of telling the story about what happened. So in 184, a dude named Zhang Jue, the Zhang family had three brothers. Zhang Jue was the ringleader. He had two brothers who, between the three of them,
he was pretty charismatic, wasn't he? He was kind of like the ringleader, if you will. He was very charismatic and kind of like the heavyweight of the three, if you will.
Yes. So he was the leader. He was the main guy. But we'll see here, his other two brothers played a very important role. Between the three of them, they founded a popular cult or a sect of under Taoism known as the Yellow Turbans. So not going to go too in depth on Taoism, but it was considered a alternative and competitive school of thought to Confucianism. So the Taoism was antagonistic to Confucianism. The Han was a Confucian court. Buddhism had not yet gained any significant ground within China at this time. Although I think Taoism and Buddhism are related, but Taoism was seen as speaking against Confucianism, and it kind of was this mystical alternative. So the Zhang brothers formed this Taoist sect, and they called themselves the Yellow Turbans. And the yellow turban kind of came from the view, it was popular for dynasties to pick a color. The Han Dynasty's color was red, like a certain shade of red. And so these guys said, "Hey, we're going to institute a new era here in China, and our color is going to be yellow." So all of their followers would wear these yellow headscarves. Some of the characteristics of what this cult or this sect would do was they were really big on performing these like miraculous healings, which is interesting because even here today in the United States, there's some strange religious I think of Benny Hinn like waving his suit jacket around, like back in the day, and you know the people that are like spazzing out on stage, like it's the 184 Chinese equivalent to that kind of stuff, uh, and through the healing, if you remember in our last episode, there were several plagues related to the Antonine Plague, disease going back and forth across the Silk Road. A lot of these peasants would um, get sick, their family would die, and they were really looking to anything because the Han and the local administrators were not really helping out at all. So this faith healing was a huge part of their sect.
Did they see? Did the average Chinese farmer, peasant, whatever, look to see this faith healing as kind of a new mandate? Like we've talked about that mandate of heaven being
Uh,
shifted around. And did they
yeah.
see this as like, oh, perhaps the current Han Dynasty has lost it, and now they're able to heal the exact problem that has come up. Perhaps the
No,
mandate has shifted.
yeah, dude, you nailed it. It's we talked about in our last episode, the Yellow River had just had a major flood. Tons of people were displaced. There's all these diseases. uh in the more like fictional, not entirely sure if this happened, but there were like eclipse, solar eclipses with earthquakes, and then you have these guys, these Zhang brothers, who can um do these miraculous healings, and it's like, yes, we have the authority, we now have the mandate, you should follow us, and we're going to institute a new reign here in China. So you're exactly right. Um, one of the things that Zhang Jue did was he was kind of a mastermind plotter. So he was not just like this Martin Luther King Jr. figure where he was like, "Oh, I'm here to preach change, but
He
I
was
have
more
no
like a
intention
David
of running the
Jones.
show."
He was more
A
like a
David
David
Jones.
Jones cult leader. Typically,
Oh yeah.
typically cult leaders tend to be very good schemers.
Right. Well, and he began plotting to overthrow the Han. And it was, again in our series on the Qing dynasty, there were like these secret societies, the Boxer Rebellion was was it the League of Harmonious Fists or something like that?
Hmm.
Uh and they formed these secret societies. Like that was very much a thing even back during the Han. And the Yellow Turbans kind of took on that character, and like there were literally hundreds of thousands of them in these different areas uh throughout northern China. And Zhang Jue had picked out these like 30 what he called generals all over northern China, and they were just kind of waiting for his word to rebel. They were going to overthrow the Han.
By the way, Jay, it's actually Jim Jones, not David
Oh,
Jones.
Jim Jones.
I think I was getting two different cult leaders,
You
two
were
cult
you were
leaders
thinking of the
crossed.
pirate, Davy Jones.
David, Jim Jones drinking the Kool Aid. Yeah, they all are schemers.
Oh, that's who Jim Jones is the Kool-Aid guy.
He's the Kool Aid guy. I don't think he actually drank it though.
Oh,
I have to get.
interesting.
I don't know enough of that history right now for the podcast, but I do know he was the one that drank the Kool Aid.
Interesting. Yeah, the cults will rear their heads from time to time.
Well, it's just kind of interesting. The kind of we talked about his personality and him being very charismatic. It's something with like faith healing. You can see why it would resonate with people, especially if you start since there's such an ingrained belief in the mandate of heaven and looking at all
Mhm.
of these great signs, it's very easy for somebody who has both a scheming personality and a charismatic personality to take advantage of that and utilize it for power.
Right.
I don't think it's going to be the last time we see it in this Fall of Empires series, but interesting.
No, it's
It's a
definitely not.
common historical thread.
Yeah, so, um, this might sound familiar to you, Colin, but the book, one of the books that Zhang Jue, quote unquote, preached from was called Crucial Keys to the Way of Peace, which in Mandarin is pronounced Taiping Yao Shu. And it was also known as, or it was based on another book called the Taiping Jing. Does that sound familiar at all to
Other than the Taiping Rebellion, but that was totally different.
That's it.
Yeah,
No,
the
that's it.
Taiping.
Yeah.
Boy, what's going on with the Taiping? It's a hot button for rebellion,
It's
hot
not
place for rebellion.
That's right. So it would not be the last time that a Taiping rebellion, were to take place. If for those of y'all that hadn't listened, there was a massive, probably one of the largest, civil conflicts,
14 years and 20 million dead.
That's
Massive.
right. All of the, in United States history on the West Coast, there were tons of Chinese immigrants, and we never got taught, we being Americans, never got taught that the whole reason why all those Chinese immigrants were coming over was this thing called the Taiping Rebellion and the famine and the bloodshed, and a lot of people died in China. So, uh, this is the Han Dynasty version of the Taiping Rebellion. Um, so another thing that Zhang Jue did was he came up with a 16 word, or like a 16 character in Chinese, um, poem slash slogan. And it was 4 sets of 4 characters. So it was like super poetic and catchy. Translated into English, the slogan is "The azure sky is already dead," referring to the Han. "The yellow sky will soon rise. When the year is Jiazi, there will be prosperity under heaven." So that, I'm probably not pronouncing that right, but I believe it's pronounced Jiazi. Uh, that year is kind of, related to this Taoist calendar, um, that was like, mm, you know, like mystical in nature, like certain predictive apocalyptic things were going to occur at certain times. So he was kind of appealing to this like religious, belief that in the end there's going to be this big calamity, but on the other end of the chaos will come a better society. So, uh, this slogan really mobilized the masses, and there were millions of Chinese peasants joined the Yellow Turbans, and they were waiting for his call. Well, something happened in 184. Zhang Jue had been coordinating with a eunuch inside the imperial court. And real quick, not going into too much detail because we're going to talk more about the eunuchs in our next episode. But essentially, the way the Han did administration was they would take men who, for whatever reason, probably, uh, they well, not probably, but these men throughout China would commit crimes for which the punishment would be castration. So these crimes were probably sexual in nature, and these men would be castrated, and then they would be sent to the court in Luoyang. The idea was that these men, made really good administrators and servants, because they were not going to mess with all of the emperor's, uh, consorts, um,
Hmm.
who were also all over the place. The emperor would have dozens, if not hundreds, of women that he would father children with, and all of these children would be in competition for the throne. Um, So the idea was that these eunuchs wouldn't mess with them, and because these eunuchs would not be able to have children themselves, the idea was that they would not try to, um, have dynastic uh, plots of their own because they can't have any kids. In
How did that
reality, this was
backfire?
it totally backfired because even though these dudes were castrated, they still were self interested and still would scheme for power. The um, all of the empress dowagers would also scheme and plot for power. It was a pretty bad situation, so much so that there would be like baby boys who would become emperor, and then they would be killed in their first year of life, just so that another baby could take over, and the eunuchs would plot and scheme too. So leaving that there, the Zhang Jue would plot and scheme with one of the eunuchs. Not entirely sure what the eunuch was doing, but the correspondence between that eunuch and Zhang had leaked. The emperor immediately had the eunuch captured, executed by I believe it was dismemberment. Um, Pretty savage means of execution.
Brutal.
Uh,
Sending a
and
message.
that that's right. Tipped him off. Well, John kind of panicked and immediately was like, "We gotta start the rebellion, boys." So look like meat's back on the menu. Sorry, please cut that part out.
Staying in.
No. Um, yeah, so launched, called up his boys and were like, now's the time. So this is like early 184. And the Yellow Turbans all over northern China, began massacring government officials, like seizing government buildings. Depending on the location, they would, each province in China at this time, they called them commanderies. The commandery administrator would either be like held for ransom, captured, executed, things like that. And everything kind of blew up all at once. So, in response, the emperor at the time, who I didn't mention this before, the emperor's name was Ling. Emperor Ling mobilized 3 separate armies to deal with the rebellion. Only going to talk about one general because one general stood head and shoulders above the other two, and that was a guy named Hung Fu Song. Hung Fu Song was by far the most successful of all these generals, and this dude, as far as like the emperor is concerned, single-handedly put down this rebellion. Now he had help, um, and he had help from other various warlords, but Hong Fu Song was the main guy that was loyal to the emperor, that put down the rebellion. He basically in less than a year he went straight for Zhang Jue. And while Zhang Jue was kind of on the run, under siege, trying to survive, he actually ended up getting sick and he passed away. Super anticlimactic for Zhang Jue, but he died, which I find wildly hilarious that a dude who was known for healing died from illness. uh,
It's ironic.
just goes to show you this dude was probably making it up. Anyway, um, yeah, so he died, and his brother, there was a younger Zhang Liang. He was kind of the second in command, and he ended up actually being more successful than Zhang Jue. So towards the end of the year, he actually started winning battles against Hong Fu Song and actually put Hong Fu on the defensive. Well, in classical, you know, Chinese fashion, Hong Fu Song resorted to trickery, and he kind of like feigned this defensive posture in this specific battle in Guangdong County. This is still northern China. Um, and ended up luring them into an attack, and then Hung Fu Song like responded, counterattacked in the middle of the night, and then completely obliterated the Yellow Turban forces. That the second Zhang brother, Zhang Liang, he died in that attack. So at least he died in battle. Uh, After that battle, so this was close to where Zhang Jue had died from illness, and they had buried him. It kind of, gave him this tomb. Uh, it was very much common for Chinese, you know, authorities to be given a lot of pomp and circumstance when they died, and their tombs were still very visible. And Hong Fu Song like ended up ordering his troops to dig up Zhang Jue's grave, cut his head off, and then send his head back to the imperial court where they put him on the walls uh, of the city walls back in Luoyang. So pretty savage here. So we've got two dead Zhang brothers, and there's one left. So um, things kind of like calmed down from there. There were several other uprisings kind of elsewhere in in northern China. The last Zhang brother, Zhang Bao, he only made it to January of the year 185. Nothing really special happened with him. He ended up just getting killed by Han forces, again by Hong Fu Song and another guy. Um, More or less hunted him down, and he didn't put up that much of a resistance. However, even though the three Zhang brothers, the leader of this rebellion, all died within a year, the idea, and this is kind of important as we move on to like more existential questions here, but the idea of the Yellow Turbans didn't die for like another 20 years. There were continued Yellow Turban minor warlords that continued to fight for the cause, uh, continued to recruit soldiers, and not recruit a small number. Like there were some warlords were able to field, you know, 15 years after the fact, Yellow Turban armies ranging in the hundreds of thousands of troops, and they caused a lot of problems elsewhere. But the main uprising was about 2 million Yellow Turbans. So there would be, in the hundreds of thousands. So the main thing was gone, but the idea remained.
Wh-
Go ahead.
Why that's interesting. Like, why did this idea, or how did the Yellow Turbans persist? For, they just got wiped out. Their three primary leaders were killed in battle.
Yeah.
Like, how did that persist? Or why did it
Yeah.
persist? Or I guess both.
Yeah. I and this is one of our key takeaways here. The reason why the Han fell fundamentally was because the Han were they didn't fix their poor governance, and the people had had enough. And authority and power specifically transferred from the Han to other people. We can throw a spiritual label on that, the mandate of heaven, but the more fundamental and pragmatic reality is the idea of the Yellow Turbans persisted because the idea that the time of the Han has ended was alive and well. And because people were so fed up with the corruption, they were so fed up with, how they interpreted things like disease in the Yellow River, destroying their homes and villages. They desperately wanted change, and they were convinced that the way they had to change things was to get rid of the Han. So the last thing here, kind of talking about the aftermath before we move into what role it contributed to the fall of the Han. In 185, at the end of the rebellion, three things. Large swaths of northern China had been completely devastated. 2 million people being slaughtered, does something to your economy in
Hmm.
184. I think one conservative historian estimate is that the total number of people under Han Chinese rule at this time was about 60 million. Just for context, within the Roman Empire at this exact same time period was about 56 million. So slightly larger, but roughly the same as in terms of sheer population as the Roman Empire. 2 million people is no small amount. Like
No,
uh that would be the equivalent, rough math off the top of my head here,
a large size city just being gone.
yeah, that would be, let's see here, 60 to 40. Geez, I don't know. Might have to cut this part out.
What are you trying to
the
figure? Like the percentage of it?
There'd be like 10 million people in the United States dying in a year.
Mm,
You know what I mean? Like
yeah.
the same percentage of people that
No,
has a massive
it'd be
impact.
closer to 15 to 20 million.
Yeah, like that is a ridiculously large number of, people dying, and that just completely devastates the local economy. You've got fields, a lot of these people were peasants, so like you've got agriculture, you have farms, you have fields. They're just like they're nobody's tilling them. Nobody's doing anything. Uh, entire villages just disappearing uh because all the men got killed in this battle. So the large swaths of northern China were devastated. Um, Total casualties are unknown. There's actually not that many sources, and one of the main sources is from like 1,000 years after the fact. Um, but estimates are somewhere like in the like I said, in the hundreds of thousands of people. So um, that's the second thing. Third thing, the one of the main aftermaths of the Yellow Turban Rebellion is that in order to fight the Yellow Turban Rebellion, the emperor called on several regional warlords to fight.
Mm,
So in kind of telling the story here, I only mentioned Hong Fu Song and the three armies. And they definitely played the main role. But in a part of that and fighting with imperial forces were like the local regional warlords who also fielded these armies, also contributed to putting down the rebellion elsewhere. uh it's worth mentioning two guys, a guy named Dong Zhuo and Yuan Shao. Both of these guys would play huge roles in the further collapse of the Han Dynasty, particularly Dong Zhuo. If you're familiar with the Romance of the Three Kingdoms story, he has a very iconic role uh, that we're actually going to go into more detail in our next episode. But Dong Zhuo was one of the main commanders of an army in northern China who fought off the Xiongnu tribes, and he had a battle hardened army that was called on to, fight Yellow Turbans. Interestingly enough, he actually lost two different battles with the Yellow Turbans, and he kind of had to like go scampering back to his capital, and he kind of was just like, I'm gonna hang out here for a little bit. Yuan Shao, on the other hand, he was only like a colonel at the time. It probably wouldn't be proper to call him a warlord during the Yellow Turban Rebellion, but he he gained in popularity amongst his troops, and then he later became a warlord, and he plays a key role. We're going to talk more about him in the next episode, but he would later massacre all of the eunuchs in the capital because he too had been fed up. And that act kind of made him a leader amongst the other warlords, so that when Dong Zhuo became the tyrant, he ended up taking control of the emperor and kind of moving into Luoyang, and then ended up burning the city down and moving to another capital, Chang'an. Uh, Yuan Shao was kind of this leader figure to try to depose Yuan Shao or Dong Zhuo. He ended up failing, but or being unsuccessful. But both of these men kind of got their start during the Yellow Turban Rebellion. And the point here for our purposes is, this is the time that when, kind of similar to the Roman Empire and the mercenary armies, that when the central government is not able to handle its business on itself, it has to delegate that power and authority to other people to try to help it to do its job. And those other people don't just relinquish that power easily.
Further tying it into Rome, I would say, like you mentioned, not quite a warlord, warlord esque, some of it, but think about Roman generals who were promoted to emperor and a claim on the throne. Like they go and defeat a great army. You have a weak emperor and things are bad in Rome.
Mhm.
Declare your general an emperor. And suddenly you have civil war and strife. And, I think that's a great point. It's just really fascinating as I listen to you go through this, like how similar the Han Dynasty was to Rome in that it was extremely powerful, but even the fall, like the Antonine Plague, obviously hit them pretty badly. They lost a huge population. There was rebellions and civil strife. There was corruption within the government that I think you'll get into next week more, but
Yeah.
corruption that had begun festering throughout the empire and created a lot of discontent amongst some of the more, we'll call them warrior class. It's just very interesting hearing that parallel. And I think it goes back to kind of why we started this whole series, to show that a lot of these empires fall kind of on this similar trajectory.
Yeah. Yeah, I so giving credit where credit's due, there's another podcast called Fall of Civilizations podcast. And they do some really well done, like well produced podcasts on various empires. Their one on the fall of the Han Dynasty is worth listening to. I was a little frustrated because over half the podcast is not about the fall of the Han Dynasty. It's about like how China, like he starts with the Qin Dynasty and doesn't start talking about like the Three Kingdoms period and like the fall of the Han Dynasty until over halfway through a almost 3 hour podcast. Aside from that part, I forget the gentleman's name who does this thing, but Fall of Civilizations podcast, he makes an interesting comparison to Dong Zhuo and Julius Caesar.
Hmm.
And I think he's onto something because the point that I'd like to make here now is like I think we can begin to build a principle in this podcast series that when a society, when a government encounters issues and they look to one person to save them, that fundamentally changes that society in a way that might be really helpful at the time, but you're kind of sowing the seeds for its own destruction in the future. And it's just a question of how much longer is it going to last when you ask for the dictator. Both Julius Caesar and Dong Zhuo became the dictator. Dong Zhuo, and both of them were assassinated in their rule. Like I said, the principle still stands that when you give that power to one person, it usually doesn't go well.
Well, talk about the difference between Dong Zhuo, Julius Caesar, and then Cincinnatus. If you remember him from one of the
Right.
podcast episodes, he relinquished the control and went back to farming.
Yeah. Which is George Washington in an American context, right? Like
Hmm.
this idea that, when George Washington intentionally didn't run for a third term in office when he could have. People wanted to make him a king and he's like, "No, we're not going to do that." Yeah, like the example of relinquishing power, it's so notable because it is so rare. And correct me if I'm wrong, but Cincinnatus was before Julius Caesar, right?
Well, hundreds of years before, like he was in the
Right.
early Roman Republic.
So there was a republic for another couple hundred years
Yeah,
because of that
exactly,
example, right?
exactly.
How like did the republic ever come back after Caesar?
Julius Caesar, no, the Republic did. The Republic was dead effectively when Julius Caesar really ultimately assumed power as a dictator. He was assassinated, and but then as soon as he was assassinated, a few years later, Octavian became Augustus, and
Right.
from there it was truly cemented. So it was like it was kind of one of those things. It was like the inevitable had already started. Like you can't. It's like squeezing a tube of toothpaste. You can't get the toothpaste back in once you do it.
Right. Right. And do you recall what this isn't Stump the Chump, but do you recall what the immediate context was to like that gave Caesar the power? Like before he crossed the Rubicon, before the Civil War and Pompeii and all that stuff, like what conflict made Caesar Caesar? It was the the Gallic
Well,
campaigns?
so oh boy, really complicated question. Yes, there was the Gallic campaigns that was designed for Julius Caesar to set himself apart and win fame because Rome still favored military success and all of that. He wanted to go back with his own campaign, and it made him wildly unpopular with the Senate and the patricians and the other aristocrats within Rome because he became so popular with the people, and they feared that he would become a dictator for life, as they would call it at that point. And
Mhm.
eventually he did, and he then without getting into a whole nother podcast series on it, but that's when he went to the first triumvirate broke up between um, Crassus, Pompey, and Julius Caesar, and he ended up going to war with Pompey, and there's the crossing of the Rubicon, and him basically taking over Rome.
Right.
Not basically, he
So
did.
in the same way, Zhang Jue, his Gallic campaigns was fighting with the Xiongnu in the northern part of China. Uh, and then when there was, his civil war was the Yellow Turban Rebellion, like his, claim to fame and his, it was also less about facts and more about the narrative, right? Like he
Always
wasn't
is
that
with
successful on
politics.
right. Like he wasn't that successful on the battlefield. He actually got beat twice. But he was able to twist this narrative that he ended up being the protector of the emperor. And later, when Emperor Liang died, and there was all this court fighting that left, I think, his like 12-year-old son in charge. Dong Zhuo ended up, showing up in Luoyang and being like, "I'm the protector of the emperor now." We'll talk more about that in the next episode, but I think the principle here is that the Yellow Turban Rebellion was a diagnosis of the Han, and that diagnosis was you are failing in your rule and the people want to change. Instead of changing their corrupt practices, exploiting the people with like super high taxes, we didn't even talk about it, but there was basically this like slave labor system at the time where people who had done nothing wrong were required to serve certain amounts of time. That could be 30 days, it could be a year, where it's just like, oh, you're a citizen of this county, you have to do your service. That was the equivalent to temporary slave labor. Um, and the peasants didn't like it, and they thought their time was being wasted, and all the government officials were taking money off the top anyway. um, and that was one of the reasons why people were tired of the Han, and add on to that the Yellow River and the disease and all the natural disasters, the famines. People were ready for a change, and the Han did nothing. They literally didn't change a single practice. It was still the eunuchs. It was still the dowagers fighting in the court. And the whole time, I didn't really go over this earlier, but Emperor Ling was notoriously a terrible ruler. He he would, like, play these games where apparently he was, like, a big fan of role play, and he would, like, have these, like he would, like, act out these different scenarios with all his girls in court, and they would, dress up to pretend to be robbers, and he would, like, pretend to be a merchant, and it's just like, "Oh, no. I'm being robbed." Like, then it would, like go in these like weird orgies. It was just like an extremely messed up time in the court. And when uh the Yellow Turbans sprang up, he was just kind of like, oh, I'm gonna dispatch these other generals to go fix it. Whereas in the past, other emperors would have gone out and fought themselves. He didn't do that.
It's kind of funny. Before you got into the whole orgy part of that, I was going to say, oh, interesting. Another very inept and kind of mildly corrupt leader used to do that same thing. Peter the
Mm,
Third, Catherine the Great's husband, he
mm,
um, he would, I thought you were going with the whole role play thing, like, oh, he would do like cops and robbers, but kind of pretend like he was this man child. But um, Peter the
yeah,
Third would actually do like toy soldiers, but they would have like actual soldiers like pretend to be toys, and he would like move them around as like chess pieces and things like that. It was
nice.
kind of a
Sounds fun.
common a commonality of uh inept rulers, if you will. I'm
Yeah,
sure he had his own weird fetishes too, sort of like
yeah. But it's almost like, and I think that this is going to be a theme in the series, but like when the people have poor leadership, the people suffer. And when the leadership is too concerned with child's play or sexual deviancy, um, you know, the nation suffers. So
100%. I mean, it's yeah, it's a symptom. He's playing games in the bedroom and the royal court, and meanwhile, his people are suffering because he can't. He's more concerned with trivialities versus tax problems, agrarian issues, poor harvest, disease, these rebels that are running wild throughout his country. So yeah,
mhm,
it's symbolic of his reign, if you will.
right, right. So so one of the main ideas I want to talk about before we move into more like application, we see here in what the Yellow Turban Rebellion did for the Han was it presented an alternate system. The system consisted of a political structure, the Zhang brothers, and it consisted of an alternate worldview or maybe an alternate religious system with their Taoist teachings. The principle here is that when within this society alternate systems present themselves and entrench themselves, that is an indicator that your current system is failing. Uh, I think that's what, going back to your earlier question, Colin, about, why did the Yellow Turban Rebellion persist? And it's like the alternate system existed. And
Hmm.
it doesn't matter how many of the people that you kill, there's an alternate system. When there's one thing when there is conflict within a society, but the two parties, the at least two parties of the conflict, they can still be operating within the same system. So I'm thinking of the historical rivalry and conflict between Republicans and Democrats, right? Like they're still operating within the current constitutional system that we have. It's when the alternative system presents itself and you no longer have two parties operating within the same system. You have one of the parties that is operating in a completely different system, a completely different worldview. That's when I think, leaders should look at themselves and go, oh, shoot, like this is much worse than we thought. Because all it takes is for the people to adhere to the competitive system. That is an irreconcilable divide between these two factions within a society. And I think that's an indicator that a civilization may be on the brink of collapse when you have these competitive systems. So kind of moving here into application, talking about destabilizing factors. You know, I mentioned we have these two competitive systems, and and how that has, you know, a destabilizing effect. One thing, you know, thinking about the Yellow Turban Rebellion, that destabilization was got out of control. The Han could no longer manage the instability. The court was too weak. The emperor was too unconcerned. There were too many other actors who were interested and invested on destabilization. Destabilization was in their best interest, and the instability got out of control. I think this is important for us to note today that like, you know, when I think about January 6th, at a minimum, January 6th was on some level a destabilizing event. Never before have we had a large mass of people break into the US Capitol building. Regardless of what your opinion is on whether it was justified or not, the objective observation is that people broke into the US Capitol building. Like, that is destabilizing at a minimum. Whether or not you think the destabilization was good, it was destabilizing, right? I think we're fortunate in that our political system, though flawed, is still strong enough to have been able to take that instability and manage it and get it back under control, right? There's still issues, right? Like, there's still, um, you know, there's a whole group of Americans that think, and believe that what occurred on January 6th was a good thing, like, fundamentally, like, that it's supposed that it was good that it occurred. Then there's a whole 'nother category of Americans that, um, you know, believe that it was an insurrection and that it was, you know, all these different things, that we should put them all in jail, like, blah, blah, blah. Like, the factors are still there, and I think it shows us that our political system is still strong enough to be able to manage that instability. Yellow Turban Rebellion and the Han, things got out of control. Uh, it was, you know, the Han, like I said, still lasted for another 25 years, but the 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 avalanche had begun and there was no going back. So kind of thinking about the destabilizing factors and what role that plays, I think there's a lot of application there for, you know, similar things here in the United States and the West.
Never discount the loss of the mandate of heaven. It's embedded in their psyche. Once they perceive that it's gone, it's almost impossible to get back, it seems.
Yeah, you know, legitimacy. Man, Colin, it's like you read my notes. That was my next point. um, I This is a good time to bring up legitimacy. So thanks, Colin, for doing that. Um, I believe it, this is, you know, this is not, you'll probably find better definitions of political legitimacy out there, but I think it's a measure of the belief and confidence that people have in their government, right? Um, Even though the Han Dynasty was successful in putting down the rebellion, they were losing their legitimacy. The legitimacy was going down next to nothing. It only had 25 years left of legitimacy in the minds of the people. Um, Legitimacy is a thing, and I think it's a thing that we here in the United States would be wise to not take for granted. You know, we were all kind of raised in this educational system that, um, you know, millennials and Gen X and boomers, we all kind of took the the goodness of our current political system for granted. Like, it was, that's what it was. Whereas I think we're seeing now in younger generations like Gen Z, we're seeing like a lot of questioning on the fundamental assumptions of our government system, and that legitimacy is being eroded. How much longer that can last, I don't know, But if we say that legitimacy is a measure of the belief and confidence that the people have in their government, uh, if we say things like the U.S. Constitution is flawed because the founders, it's an inherently systematically racist thing, right? Therefore, it needs to be done away with. That is an indicator uh, that there are suggestions that we need to have a competitive and alternative system, right? The current system isn't working. We need a different system. That's how civilizations collapse.
Mm.
Not to go too crazy on the systematic racism part, because there's obviously
Just
a
an
lot
example. It's
of
just a
other
hot button.
factors.
It's a hot button.
But like it's a thing. Like it is a factor. Like
No, well,
it is
right.
we would be unwise to just disregard and say like, that's the minority of people. Like it may very well be the minority of people, but the Zhang brothers started out being the minority of people. Even the Yellow Turban Rebellion was the minority of people. And
Hmm.
like I said, like these destabilizing factors can get out of control really fast. So one last and final point here, and that is on the topic of power. Uh, and this is kind of why what I took away from studying like Zhang Jue, Yuan Shao, all of the other regional warlords. Um, the decentralization of power, like the distribution of power, it can have a stabilizing effect. But in other situations and circumstances, it can have a destabilizing effect. And again, I think the key difference between those two things are, do those different foundations of power, or put another way, those power brokers, are they operating within the same system, or are they bringing about a different system? And go ahead.
I was going to say, I think your power, legitimacy, and legitimacy grants power authority. So
Mm,
if you have legitimacy and you are in power, you have the authority to exercise that power over a group of people. But if you lose the legitimacy, suddenly that authority begins to be stripped from you and you're no longer able to exercise power justly in the eyes of those people. So then that's when you start to get rebellions. That's when you start, and it becomes like a cycle. So it's sort of like you lose a little bit of legitimacy. So you lose some of that authority, the ability to exercise that power over some sort of cause or rebellion, and then that rebellion grows and grows and grows, and all these other things happen and all these poor decisions start happening. Suddenly you've lost all of your authority and legitimacy, to exercise any power, and now you can't even exercise power whatsoever. So I think they
right.
all kind of go hand in hand, and I think that's what
Yeah.
happened with the Han. I think it happened in Rome. It's happening in the Han Dynasty as we go through this Yellow Turban Rebellion.
Right. I so I love to push the envelope here on the loins of history, Colin.
Do it. Do it.
Donald Trump. Donald Trump is the perfect example of someone who is a person of immense power, right? There are people who are radical Donald Trump followers, right? Uh, in a way that, even though Donald Trump lost to Joe Biden, literally nobody gets juiced up about Joe Biden the way that a lot of people get juiced up about Donald Trump. Currently, Donald Trump is operating in the same system as everybody else. However, his whole brand is that he is on the fringes of that system, that he seeks to change the system, but he's not yet gotten to the point where he is proposing an alternative system. He's been flirting with these ideas, and I would consider the whole stolen election claims as dangerously flirting with proposing an alternative system, right? When we can no longer trust the mechanism that puts officials in office, right? The voting system. Uh, and I mean that in like most comprehensive way, like the machinery, the ballot counting, the local, like super local city administrators that count the ballots, etc., all the way up to the news stations that report all of these different things. Like he has poured gasoline on the fire of, you know, proposing an alternative system. Frankly, I think the only reason why it's not working is because Donald Trump's alternative system is solely and completely focused on himself. He's not he's not a visionary in that, he's actually less visionary than maybe Zhang Jue and the Zhang brothers were, because he's not proposing a comprehensive system. He's just trying to present himself as the alternative person. As a matter of fact, the closest thing that he's come to doing on alternative system is Truth Social, and
Hey, we're on
I
Truth
haven't.
Social too.
Are we? Please tell me we're not on Truth
Oh,
Social.
we're on Truth Social.
God. Oh no.
Hey, we got to get some boomers on it. We got to get boomers on the podcast too.
Oh man. Ugh. Why are we on Truth Social?
Gotta get the word out, man. I
Gotta get
retweet
the word out, I
episodes out there
guess.
too. I retrue them.
All right. You retrue them? Is that what you call it?
I don't know. I don't log in very often.
Okay. Well, either way, like I would, you can't say that Truth Social is a failure because there's people on the system, but at the same time, like it's not very compelling as an alternative social media website or thing.
Nothing has really.
Um,
Very rarely are people able to create an alternative social media site. It almost has to grow over time and have it has to go from the grassroots up, because if you notice, there's been more than one social media alternative proposed. I think
oh yeah,
Mammoth was for a little while. Once Elon bought, it was the leftist equivalent of Truth Social, like Mammoth, and it
right.
has utterly disappeared. I think Threads was thrown out there too, and within like 2 days, just
Was that
we
Was that Meta's version of
it
Twitter?
was, and it was a complete
Yeah.
copy. And I think there's almost a lawsuit. I think there might still be a lawsuit going because they
Mm,
basically copied X. Anyway, just to
hmm.
point that out there, it's funny. There's lots of alternatives out there. None have
Yeah.
really had the success of the mainline X
Yeah.
or TikTok.
I The reason why I bring up Donald Trump, because if I'm a betting man, there's probably quite a few of our listeners that like Donald Trump. The takeaway that I hope we all have about Donald Trump in particular uh, is just like the reality here that whether you love him or whether you hate him, he is a significant power source, right? Like he wields significant political power still. Um, and if he chooses to wield that political power in a way that presents an alternative system that can be extremely destabilizing, in a way that I'm not sure those same people who would say that they're fans of Donald Trump, I'm not sure that those people would say that they're in favor of him doing that, if that makes any sense. I just want to bring awareness to the point that we are actually really close to some pretty scary stuff. And I'm not trying to make a comment on the likelihood of Donald Trump, going full bore, blah 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 blah. I'm not trying to make a comment on that. I certainly can't predict the future and blah blah blah. I also don't. I guess it's probably worth me saying. I absolutely don't adhere. Like when he was in office, there were all these comparisons to Hitler and the Nazis. I think all of that was completely overblown. Um, but being honest, like a lot of the stolen election claims were very disturbing to me, because that was, one of the main things where it's like, ooh, that's not good. Like that's not good for society. Like that's not good for stability. That's not good for healing divisions and wounds. Like that's pouring gasoline on the fire. uh, in addition to just, thinking about like Sidney Powell going up there, like, in the My Pillow guy, like all of those people have been completely debunked. That's like virtually none of the things that they were saying were true, uh, and and have not held up in court. So anyway, the that is an example of when you have competitive power brokers, they can have destabilizing effects on society. We saw this with the Yellow Turbans. We saw this with Zhang Jue. I think we're going to continue to see this over and over again in our Fall of Civilizations series.
Well, as we said, we do like to correct political illiteracy as well. So I do. That was a good push and way to connect it to uh, current events. Jay,
Yeah,
very
we
good
try.
wrapping it up.
We try.
It was. We try. Uh,
Hey, and if you're listening all the way to the end of the podcast, thank you. Give us a shout out. I want to know who's listening. And please tell me, do you agree or not? If you disagree, I definitely want to know
all the good
all
stuff
about the
comes out at the
conversation,
very end. That's where all the controversial stuff starts getting leaked out.
which
But
is
anyway,
purely incidental, by the way.
pure. It's just where we start. It's where we start free flowing right there. But no,
Mm.
this Jay, this is very informative. Great summary of the Yellow Turban Rebellion. I think we're learning a lot of the fall of the Han Dynasty, and we got one more episode left before we wrap everything up on the Han Dynasty and move on to our next civilization. If you're on social media, give Jay and I a follow. We're on Loins of History on X, on Instagram. Apparently, we're on Truth Social too, though we're not very active on it. It's primarily
I'm not
Twitter.
active at all on Truth Social.
It's primarily Instagram and X, though I might dabble in Mammoth or Threads. We'll see. Um, but yeah, give us a shout out as well. You can contact us via Gmail or direct message us via social media. We love having listeners reach out to us and give us your feedback. We've had a few listeners do that before in the past, and we do appreciate it. If you give us a 5-star rating and a comment, we'll give you a shout out. Or if you have some feedback and you're listening all the way to the end, we do appreciate it as well. So go ahead and give us that 5-star review. It helps the algorithm, and then write a little review for us. We do appreciate constructive criticism, and we'll give you a shout out at the end of the episode as well, or maybe the beginning now, so we make sure we get everybody to hear it. So with that, thank you, and thank you for listening to the Loins of History.